Hello, BookTube, and welcome to another weekly reading vlog. I'd like to start this week off by apologizing for last week's weekly reading vlog. Kind of. Actually, it might be one of those non-apologies because at the end of it, I'm not going to change anything about the way I do things here, but I do want to at least acknowledge that last week's video was not great. And I knew it wasn't great, even as I was filming it. I was sleep deprived, tired at the time I was filming it for a number of reasons relating to work and family, etc. And there was something I was thinking, maybe I shouldn't be filming this. This is not going to be of any value, but for better or for worse, the way I run this channel is keeping to the schedule is prioritized over the quality of the videos. So I've decided I'm going to film a weekly reading vlog every week, try and do it on the Sunday, whether I feel tired or whether I feel great or whether I am struggling to form sentences or whether I'm feeling particularly loquacious, etc. But yeah, last week's video was one where I was just feeling exhausted, and I think that came through in the quality of the video. I'm a little bit nervous actually about making this apology at the beginning of the video because who knows how this one's going to turn out, huh? I've only just pressed record here, but we'll have to see how the next 30 minutes go. Perhaps this video will end up being just as terrible. The other thing I think is causing these weekly reading videos to suffer is when I started doing them almost a year ago, I was reading a couple books at a time and was able to talk somewhat intelligently about the sections of those books I'd read for the week. I've got a bad habit of letting my reading list balloon because I tend to get bored with what I'm reading and then add on more books before I finish what I started. And so that ends up with a collection like this, in which I only read a handful of pages from each one every week, which makes it difficult for me to form my thoughts. I mean, before I even start the video, I'm like, oh, okay, so what did I read from Herodotus this week again? What am I going to talk about? Makes it a little bit difficult to for one, just hold in memory all the different bits and pieces I read from the past week. But then secondly, to talk intelligently about it. Yeah, I think I've overcommitted myself in terms of reading, so I'll probably look to winnow that down, maybe. Unfortunately, some of these projects, I'm going to be working on them for a while, but once I finish off some of these books, maybe thinking of trying to not start any new books for a while. Speaking of not starting any new books for a while, or maybe the opposite of that, I've got a little bit of a book haul this week. 2 books. Counts as a book haul on this channel. So I had promised myself I wouldn't buy any new books until I cleared out the books on my bookshelf. In fact, I've got a number of books that I talked about in the last book haul I did, whenever that was, that I haven't even touched, because I'm still working on this stack. But I had to go into town for a work-related errand. I'd been putting it off because I hate making these trips into town if I can avoid them, but this one couldn't be avoided. And then as a reward for going into town, I went to what is known as Book Street here in Saigon, which is a street that has a bunch of little booksellers, some used shops, some new shops, and they contain some English books. And I love browsing in bookstores. I always during those moments when I'm browsing through the bookstores, I always imagine myself as a better reader than I am. Like, oh, I could read this, and I could read this, and I could read that. And of course, then I buy all these books, and I never get around to reading them because I only read 10 books a year or something. But I got a couple. Harriet the Spy, which is a children's book, so I could probably totally read this. I was going to say I could read this in an afternoon. And I could read this in an afternoon if I was somebody else. At my reading pace, this will be a couple of afternoons, but it could finish it off easily enough. I'm a little bit reluctant to tackle it now because I've got even though I could just finish it off in a couple of afternoons, I've got all these other books which I should be spending my attention on in the afternoons. Harriet the Spy is a classic children's novel. I think it was published in 1965 or something like that. 1964. And it's something I remember vaguely from my elementary school days. I don't think I ever read it, although I could be wrong. I don't think it was ever read to me, although I could be wrong. It was definitely a book that, like, the librarians at my school liked. My elementary school teachers liked, and it was definitely recommended to me in elementary school. If I ever read it, I'd forgotten it. I think I've read sections of it, like excerpts of it. Maybe it would pop up in something else. It's a type of book that school teachers really like, but as a young boy, did not fit my particular interests. I was interested in adventure stories and dragons and that fantasy type stuff, and adventure and pirates and all that kind of stuff. So, but I forget how. Sometime within the past year, this book was brought to my attention again. Maybe somewhere on BookTube. Maybe I just happened across it somewhere on the internet, I forget. But for whatever reason, I stumbled across a reference to this book. I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about that book. And I felt nostalgic for it, even though I don't think I've ever read it, just because it reminded me of the type of children's books that used to be popular among my teachers in elementary school. And then I saw it on Book Street, and I thought, yeah, why not? So pick this one up. The other one is a fantasy book, The Wayfarer Redemption, which is a little bit beat up, and it's got, those spots on it that old used books get. And this was in a bookstore on Book Street that was specializing in these beat up used books. So I have an interest in these paperback fantasy novels. That interest is counterbalanced by the fact that I'm such a slow reader. So I'm vaguely interested in these kinds of things in theory. I seldom have the patience to make it all the way through. But when I see these kind of things at the bookstore, it does attract my attention. What drives me crazy, especially living out here in Asia, and I've been living abroad for my whole adult life, either Japan or Cambodia or Vietnam, is they're all part of a series. And when you find them just in the used bookstores, you just find one of them. So this particular used bookstore that I was looking through had a bunch of fantasy books. And they were all like book 4 of 8 or, something like that, part of a larger series. I think if I had been living back home in the U.S. the past 20 years, perhaps I would have read a lot more of these fantasy series than I have. Maybe fantasy would dominate my reading more than it has. But I always think to myself, I can't just buy one book out of the series. I've got to track down the whole series. And it's very seldom that you track down the whole series. Unless it's something uber famous. like the Lord of the Rings, and then even out here in Vietnam, then you can get the box set. But I mean, aside from the uber famous ones, just these other ones, you can never seem to track down them all. But after kind of looking through this in the bookstore, this is book one of, I think, three. Although it looks like it was published, looks like it was an Australian author, and it looks like it was published somewhat differently in the U.S. and in Australia. But I think in Australia, at least, this was from Bendigo, Victoria. I've been to Bendigo in Victoria. That's where the author lives, Sarah Douglas. Anyways, depending on the U.S. or Australian edition, I guess it's different, but it's part of a series. But it was book one of the series. So I thought, well, okay, maybe I can give it a try. I mean, if it was book like 2 or 3 of the series, forget it. But book one, even, I mean, the sometimes these series are good at having self-contained stories within each book, and then the sequels are just sequels. And sometimes you get to the end of the first book and you're just left hanging to find out what's going on. But at the very least, at least it's the first book. And because I seldom have the patience for these long series anyways, then maybe it's just as well I stop in the middle. 11 minutes in, and I haven't even started with my reading for this week. This is going to be another long-winded video. Okay, so reading for this week is these books here. I'll try and move through them fairly quickly. Studying the Vietnamese book, in which I'm still going through the alphabet page, listening to the audio twice a day, and then just very slowly going through this. I may pick up with the pace on this someday, but at the moment I've got other things I'm juggling. Herodotus, I mentioned this last week. Because I'm making such slow pace on Herodotus, I've started listening to the audiobook, the free audiobooks that are uploaded onto YouTube of this. And I finished off book one of the audiobook and am into book 2 on the audiobook. At the same time, I'm making very slow progress through my reading. I think I just read 8 pages this week. Still talking about the Spartan kings in book 6. But yeah, balancing that out with reviewing the earlier chapters on audiobook. So hopefully I get the whole experience. Mostly finished off Tik-Tok of Oz from the Complete Stories of Oz. I'm doing this as a buddy read with Dane Cobain at Dane Reads. He's actually already published his review of Tik-Tok of Oz on his channel, which I haven't watched yet because I want to finish it first. But I think I'm just 6 pages away from finishing it, and then I will look at his review and publish a review of my own of this. Probably tomorrow if I keep on schedule. So I don't really want to talk about this here too much because I'll be talking about it tomorrow. The grammar book. So finished off the chapter on other structures that look like questions. There are exercises in the back like there are in every chapter, but no sentence diagrams. Sorry. I shouldn't say diagrams, sentence trees. No sentence trees for this chapter because it was more about meaning rather than form in this chapter. So that I was able to not waste too much time on that. And then I'm into the chapter on articles. articles like a, and, the. So if you've ever taught English as a second language, especially if you taught it in Asia, you know that articles are a source of tremendous confusion to the students and actually to the teachers as well, because most teachers like me come out here to teach English having being native speakers, having an intuitive idea of what sounds right and what sounds wrong, but struggling to articulate that into rules the students can follow for using articles. So it's something, it's been a frustration for me since I've been teaching English, as it has been for all English teachers. What's interesting about this chapter is they talk very briefly about the distinctions between a, and the, but then they're spending the rest of the chapter talking about the difference between count and non-count nouns, and then common and proper nouns, because that determines which articles you use on that. And then, yeah, that's the part I'm up to so far. Then I guess the meaning of definite and indefinite articles is going to be the second part of the chapter. So, yeah, still working my way through that. Okay, the Two Towers. So I read 48 pages this week. I'm with the parts with Sam and Frodo and Gollum doing their traveling. So I've mentioned this before when I've been talking about these Lord of the Rings books. There is a lot of landscape description in Tolkien in these books, which I struggle with. I struggle visualizing it. I often struggle with his vocabulary when he's talking about the landscapes. I'm like, what does that word mean? Is there a good example here? There were. Sorry, I'm gonna have. I haven't bookmarked the examples, but just anytime you're talking about the landscapes, there are. Yeah. Yeah. Here we go. This is relatively random, but I think this will serve my point. Before them, as they turned west, gentle slopes ran down into dim hazes. What is a haze used in this context? Dim hazes. Does that mean fog, or is that a landscape descriptor? Far below. All about them were small woods of resinous trees. I think resinous is a type of pine tree, right? Fir and cedar and cypress and other kinds unknown in the Shire, with wide glades among them. Okay, glade. I should know this, right? What is a glade? Is it a space between trees? And everywhere there was a wealth of sweet-smelling herbs and shrubs. The long journey from Rivendell had brought them far south of their own land, but not until now in this more sheltered region had hobbits felt the change of clime. Okay, what is a clime? Is that like the weather? Here spring was already busy around them. Fronds pierced moss. Okay, I know moss, but what is a frond? And mold. Now, mold spelled M-O-U-L-D. So not like the mold on your bread, I don't think. So I know what moss is, but what is a mold? Larches were green-fingered. What does that mean? What is a larch? Small flowers were opening in the turf. Turf means dirt here, I think, right? Birds were singing, etc. It goes on that way for actually most of that page. So, yeah, I get the rough idea, but that unknown vocabulary just discourages me or encourages my brain to switch off lots of the time. So whenever you get to a part where the plot is actually happening, characters are talking to each other, or stuff related to the plot is actually happening, then I've got no problem following the book. But I tend to tune out a lot during those other spots. Although that being said, as I've acknowledged in previous videos, I think for a lot of Tolkien fans, that pastoral romance, or that romance, those descriptions of the magical nature, the fantasy. What am I looking for here? The appeal of the fantasy world is that it's a natural, beautiful nature type world. So yeah, that's something that's been ongoing throughout this series. And when Sam and Frodo and Gollum are talking to each other, those descriptions do bore me, or I struggle with them. The other thing that may be worth talking about in this section is as they get to Mordor, they see there's all the goblins and orcs that are fighting for Mordor, but there's also humans. Now, in the earlier part of this book, I think it was described as like the hill tribes, which are like these savage people, had joined up with Mordor. But in this second part of the book, it's talking about the Southerners are joining up with Mordor, which is described as people with dark skin or black skin or swarthy. And I actually kind of knew this was coming, because I think I had read this on Wikipedia years ago. I spend way too much time on Wikipedia. That this was one of the controversies about Tolkien's books, is that the humans in service of Mordor are described as being of dark skin. But it's one thing to know it's coming, and it's another thing to actually read it, where you're like, oh yeah, okay, that's that wouldn't be published nowadays. And I hesitate to make too big a deal out of it, because the book itself doesn't make too big of a deal about it. I mean, it's mentioned, but it's not harped on. But it is mentioned, and it's I think it's unfortunate, and I don't think it ruins the book necessarily or anything like that. And of course, yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's not exactly clear, at least from the sections I've read, if the humans are joining up with Mordor because they are dark-skinned, or if they're just humans who happen to be dark-skinned and they're joining up with Mordor. It seems like it's the latter from the way it's described in the book, and the humans are definitely differentiated from the orcs. So when the human dies, even when it's dark-skinned one, that the characters feel some regret about it. There's some effort to spare the humans, which is never true of the orcs. So that there's definitely that differentiation there. But I think the problem with this book is that it, as with all other stuff, is it's not written in a vacuum. It's written into the history of the Western world, in which we've got this racial history and these problems, and very hard not to see those through the lens as you're reading this book. All right. I think that's all I'm going to say about that for this week. And then tried to get through those other books as quickly as I could, because I'm going to blab on and on about Exodus for this week. So Exodus 12 to 22 this week. Is that right? I think 21. Exodus 12 to 21. I haven't quite started 22. Sorry. So I was talking about Exodus last week and spent a lot of time blabbering over it last week. And it strikes me actually that one of the things that I didn't talk about last week, I don't think, which I really should have, is the 12 plagues, because like that's like one of the most famous parts of the whole Bible, and something which definitely grabs your imagination. It's been, I think, visualized on screen. It's been visualized in countless illustrations in children's Bible books and stuff like that. And you read it and you can't help but try to visualize it as you're reading it. So it's classic biblical stories in that sense. It does, right? So when I began this series of reading the Bible, rereading the Bible on this channel, I said that I was going to try to avoid making this an effort of being like Christopher Hitchens and being criticizing everything. And yet I find I can't help it. I think a lot of that is because the last time I read this, the last time I read it carefully, cover to cover, I was much younger, 7th grade, I believe, and I was still a Christian at that time. So did not have nearly the skeptical eye that I do now, and things are just jumping out at me, which never occurred to me the previous times I've read this as a young Christian. So, the first thing, I think I did mention this last week, actually. There's some inconsistency with what actually is going on. Sometimes it looks like Pharaoh comes out to Moses and says, "Look, I'm sorry, please stop this." And then Moses prays to God and the plague stops. And then God hardens Pharaoh's heart again. Sometimes, though, it's not actually clear that the previous plague has actually stopped before God begins the next one, or at least it's not stated explicitly in the text. So I don't know how many of these plagues are overlapping. But, the other thing that I can't help but think about is how unrealistic this whole thing is. And I don't mean the idea of this all-powerful, omnipotent God, because that's just part of the genre. That's just part of the given part of this text. You assume that there's a God who can do anything. But it seems like any one of these plagues would completely devastate Egypt. So it's a little bit funny that there's any Egypt left for all 10 plagues to hit. So, like the Nile River turns to blood for 7 days. And you're like, well, okay. All the water in Egypt has turned to blood or something like that. Yeah, the Egyptians dug holes along the banks of the river in search of drinking water. They found the water of the river impossible to drink. Okay, so they are getting drinking water, but still, everything in the Nile is dying after 7 days because the water is blood. And then, even if it switches back to water, the whole economy of Egypt is ruined, right? Everybody who makes the whole Egypt has just got to be collapsing internally. And probably has outside enemies that are going to be taking advantage of this, but I guess for the sake of this story, we're forgetting about the outside world. And then it's all the way through, like the plague of the frogs, or the death of the livestock, or the hail. Like it's just you would think that the people of Egypt would all be starving and dead long before you got to the 10th plague. The other thing is, this all seems a little bit silly. So God is hardening Pharaoh's heart so that Pharaoh is not releasing the Israelites, so that God can do all 10 plagues, because God wants to show Egypt his might. But I mean, it just all seems a little bit ridiculous that, or not, maybe ridiculous is the wrong word. It seems a little bit strange that God is even concerned with what these Egyptians think of him. I mean, right? This is the God of the universe, the creator of everything. I mean, what does he care about what this country in some small corner of Africa thinks about him? And I mean, obviously, if he wanted to, he could just come in and sweep Egypt off the map and just take his people into the promised land. So the whole idea of doing these miracles to impress humans, I don't know, seems a little bit strange. I know I said I wasn't going to get into all these nitpickings and criticisms of the Bible, but I can't help but notice this, and it's different. It's stuff I didn't notice when I was last reading the Bible. Okay, so we get to the end of the 10th plague. The narrative begins to be interspersed here with material that I think is from the P source, the priestly source, because it talks about how you're going to celebrate the Passover, and it talks about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And it seems to me to be two different things, which are the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread seems to be marking the same event, but it's a little bit unclear to me what the difference between them is. So I actually went on Wikipedia and looked this up. And Wikipedia, I looked up the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and somewhat to my surprise, there wasn't a Wikipedia entry on the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Which I was surprised at, because there's like a Wikipedia entry for everything these days, right? I don't know, maybe give it another 5 years and it will have its own Wikipedia entry. There was stuff on rabbinical websites, or websites for Judaism, which were explaining it, but I didn't really read it terribly carefully. If it's not on Wikipedia, sometimes that's the end of my research. Then there's the famous thing about crossing of the Red Sea. Throughout this section, the thing about the Jerusalem Bible, which is different than the NIV version I grew up with, something I've been mentioning frequently in these discussions, is the footnotes are often pointing out the contradictions. So, for example, the Israelites are fleeing from Egypt, and they're taking with them bread that's unleavened because they don't have time to make it rise. It says in the text, okay, well, you're going to have this celebration in remembrance of this when you didn't have time to make the unleavened bread. And the footnotes point out, they said, well, actually, according to the earlier chapters, this is actually not why they have the unleavened bread with them. They were commanded to do the unleavened bread even before they were fleeing. So just little interesting footnotes like that. What else do they have here? There's another section when they're in the desert, and God is giving them the manna from heaven. Everybody knows that story, right? The manna out in the desert. And Aaron is commanded to gather up some of the manna and keep it in a jar so that it's there for future generations, so that they can see what God has given them The future generations can see the evidence that God provided manna to the people. It says, Moses said to Aaron, take a jar and put in it a full omer. Omer is some sort of measurement of manna, and place it before Yahweh to be kept for your descendants. Accordingly, Aaron put a full omer of manna in the jar as Yahweh had ordered Moses, and placed the manna before the testimony to be kept there. Now, what is the testimony? It says in the footnote, it says, that is the tablets of the law. The testimony is the tablets of the law kept in the ark or the chest. Now, at this point, there is no tablets of the law, and there is no ark or chest, because they haven't gone up to Mount Sinai yet. So it continues, it says, but in the tradition from which the main narrative comes, the tablets and the ark have not been instituted. So this is, again, I guess these are different sources being put together. In the main narrative that we're following here, the tablets and the ark are coming later, but in this section of the narrative, which is apparently from a different source, they already have the tablets and the manna. So there's little footnotes like that explaining the inconsistencies or pointing out the inconsistencies, but I really wish I had more footnotes, because there are so many things here where you're like, okay, what's going on here? There's so many things that just get repeated, where you're like, why are we going through this again? Didn't we just go through this in the previous paragraph? And I'm assuming that this is, again, because different sources are being conflated. But it would be nice to have the opinion of the scholars to go along with that, which would help in the footnotes here. And I know I could look this all up on the free commentaries on Bible Hub, but going to the internet for every single chapter can be a little bit tiresome. So sometimes I'm just plowing through. There are, along with stuff being needlessly repeated, is a lot of things where stuff seems to be missing. So, for example, Exodus 18, Jethro and Moses. So, Jethro is Moses' father-in-law, who had been introduced in the beginning of Exodus. So it says, Jethro, priest of Midian, father-in-law of Moses, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for his people, and how Yahweh had brought Israel out of Egypt. So Jethro, father-in-law of Moses, brought Moses' wife Zipporah after she had been dismissed. What does that mean? Dismissed by who? With her 2 sons. One of these was named Gershom, because he had said, I am a stranger in a foreign land. So Gershom we've heard about before. That was Moses' son that was mentioned previously. The name of the other was Eliezer. So the other one I don't think we've heard about before. I think that's the first time he's been mentioned here. Which, I guess he could have been born off screen, outside of what's being detailed in the narrative. Fair enough, but it just seems like there are sections missing. Zipporah being dismissed seems to be missing. Okay, yeah, anyways, back to the narrative, which is a little bit confusing because of all the stuff which appears to be either missing or needlessly repeated. But, the whole thing about how the Egyptians pursue the Israelites. Oh, yeah, speaking of which, this parting of the Red Sea, this is something where, again, I'm wondering, it would be nice to have more footnotes here, because it seems to me maybe like 2 different sources are being conflated here, but I'd like to have the opinion of the experts to check with. It seems like in one version there's a wind that's coming, and that's blowing the sea away. And then in another version, the sea is just parting directly in the middle. You know, that's the Hollywood version, right? Where the Red Sea just parts in the middle. But before the Red Sea parts in the middle, there's something about how a wind was blowing the Red Sea off to one side. Now, again, you've got to feel a little bit for Pharaoh and the Egyptians here, because it's repeatedly mentioned the whole time that God is hardening their hearts and God is kind of leading them into this disaster. Then there's a part about the manna and the quails, water from the rock, and then the battle against the Amalekites. So, the Amalekites. The Amalekites are some. I do vaguely remember hearing about them when I was growing up in the Christian school system, and I do remember hearing about this ambush in the desert. I do vaguely remember how this came back later with Samuel's command to kill the Amalekites. But there was God commanded a lot of people to be killed in the Old Testament, so it didn't really stand out to me so much in my Christian school days when I was a youngster. But it's something that I've come across in adulthood, I guess, especially because of the internet, because atheists and skeptics love to talk about the Amalekites. So, and again, and in one sense, this isn't unique, because God commands a lot of people to be wiped out in the Old Testament. But there's something, the Amalekites seem to pop up again and again and again. So this is the first time when they pop up, kind of. Amalek is mentioned in Genesis. He's one of the grandsons of Esau. But here, the Israelites are in the desert, and it says the Amalekites came and attacked Israel at Rephidim, and that's all it is. I had somehow imagined or remembered or thought that there was a bit of a longer thing there about the ambush of the Amalekites, but just that little verse. And then Moses said to Joshua, and I think actually this is the first time Joshua has come up in the narrative, unless I'm remembering wrong. Pick out men for yourself, and tomorrow morning march out to engage Amalek. So in this translation, they're talking about Amalek, not the Amalekites, but I think they're interchangeable. Amalek is the ancestor of the Amalekites, but and then Moses stands on the hill, and as long as he keeps his arms up, Israelites will win. But when he gets tired and he puts his arms down, the Israelites will lose. So his arms are being held up by Aaron and Hur. Aaron, of course, is Moses' brother. Who is Hur? I forgot, or I don't know. And I should have looked this up, but I forgot to look this up. So, anyways. So the Israelites beat the Amalekites. And then Yahweh says to Moses, write this action down in a book to keep the memory of it, and say in Joshua's hearing that I shall wipe out the memory of Elimelech from under heaven. Moses then built an altar and named it Yahweh Nisi, because he said, lay hold of the banner of Yahweh. Yahweh is at war with Amalek from age to age. So this will become a theme throughout the Old Testament, and perhaps something I'll talk about again when it comes up again as I go through the Old Testament. I guess in Deuteronomy, the commandment to wipe out the Amalekites is repeated. And then in Samuel, Saul is commanded to wipe out the Amalekites. And then I believe in in 2 Kings or something, Hezekiah's battles against the Amalekites are described. And then I believe in Esther, Haman is described as being a descendant of the Amalekites. So it's a little bit confusing because you get the impression in 1 Samuel that the Amalekites are wiped out by Saul. Saul spares the king and he spares the livestock, but then Samuel kills the king, I believe. But then they pop up again later in 2 Kings, and then you get the impression that Hezekiah wiped them all out. They're always being wiped out. So atheists or skeptics or people who like to criticize the Bible like to bring up this idea of this injunction to just kill the Amalekites wherever they may end up. Because they're Amalekites, you have to kill them. No matter what century it is, no matter where they are, this is just some injunction that God has laid on them. So that's bizarre in and of itself. What fascinates me about this is where do these stories come from? I guess in the Bible, the Amalekites are described, inhabitants of the mountain country of Seir in the northern part of Negev. I looked this up on a map online, and it looks like, if you have the Mediterranean here, you have Judah here, and then the territory of the Amalekites is kind of below Philistia, next to Judah, going towards the Arabian Peninsula, I think. And there's historians and archaeologists can't find any evidence that the Amalekites actually existed outside of the Bible. So they might not even have existed. They might be a completely mythological race of people that's just been, in which case you wonder, well, how did they even get in? Where do these stories come from? And it's not like they're the main enemies of the Israelites, right? I mean, in the Old Testament narrative, the Philistines pop up much more often, or the Moabites. These are like the main adversaries, the Edomites, the main adversaries of the Israelites, and it all comes from this one attack out in the desert. Apparently is where this command comes to wipe out all the Amalekites. But the Philistines caused the Israelites much more trouble than that, right? And then, you can go down these rabbit holes online so easily. Encyclopedia Britannica, which is one of the first things that popped up in Google when I put in the Amalekites. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, it says they're the traditional enemies of the Israelites, even though they're related to Ephraim. Now I'm reading this and I'm thinking, wait a second, how are they related to Ephraim? Because according to the genealogy in Genesis, they're not. Ephraim is the son of Joseph, and the Amalekites are the grandsons of Esau. And the Encyclopedia Britannica is not, it's good that it's all available for free online, like Wikipedia is, but it's not equal to Wikipedia. You can't find out, okay, where are the sources, why is it saying this, where are the hyperlinks. So then I Google searched, okay, how are the Amalekites related to Ephraim? Because I thought, well, if it's in Encyclopedia Britannica, there must be something there, right? And it appears that there is some sort of verse in Judges, which says something like how the Amalekites, how Ephraim comes from the Amalekites, or something like that, which is open to a whole bunch of different interpretations. Maybe Ephraim and the Amalekites intermarried at some point, or were living near each other at one point. I don't think they're near each other on the map. If you look at the map of where the Amalekites were supposed to be, the Amalekites were closer to Judah, but whatever. So I I guess the point is, one, this whole thing with the Amalekites can be interesting. Two, it's very easy to fall down these rabbit holes when you're reading the Old Testament. And this is... I was watching Steve Donahue's videos, one of his Q&A sections, and he was talking about how easy it is to just get these canons of Western literature under your belt. And he said, you could read the Gospels in an afternoon. Just sit down and read the Gospels in an afternoon, and then you've got those under your belt. And I was thinking, well, okay, yeah, you could read them in the afternoon. You could read maybe Genesis and Exodus in an afternoon, but that's not counting the 2 hours on Wikipedia you spend trying to figure out what in the heck this verse means and how it relates to the others. Yeah. The word count is not equal to the amount of effort you spend on it, I guess is the point. Okay. And then I think my memory of this from the last time I read it, and the last time I read it straight through was in 7th grade, was from here on out, the narrative is broken up by sections about the laws. And I got the impression the last time I read through the Pentateuch of the narrative in the laws just being a little bit random. Like, okay, here's some narrative, here's some laws, here's some narrative, here's some laws. Be interesting to see going through this again the second time if there's any more system I can differentiate between the narrative and the laws. But so they go to Mount Sinai. There's a whole section on preparing the people to meet God at Mount Sinai. And then in Exodus 20, there's the 10 Commandments, or as it's called in the Jerusalem Bible, the Decalogue. Now, something that skeptics and atheists are fond of pointing out is that there's actually 2 sets of the 10 Commandments in the Bible. So, your friendly neighborhood atheist will say something like, there's that, we can't talk about the 10 Commandments. There's actually 2 different versions of the 10 Commandments. It's something I've heard from folks like Christopher Hitchens and stuff like that for years. And sure enough, right even here in the footnotes, it's pointed out that the 10 Commandments are repeated again in Deuteronomy 5 in a different version. And according to the Jerusalem Bible, it says that the version Deuteronomy 5 is the version that the church has gone with. So I went and I compared both versions. And I have to say, I think it's somewhat maybe been exaggerated, the difference between these 2 versions. The words are different, but the commandments are essentially the same. So, for example, honor your father and your mother so that you may have a long life in the land that Yahweh your God has given to you. This one is, honor your father and your mother as Yahweh your God has commanded you, so that you may have long life and may prosper in the land that Yahweh your God gives to you. So, assuming the different wording in English reflects a different wording in the original Hebrew, there are some different words there, but that's essentially the same commandment, and it's like that for all 10 of them. As far as I can tell. Let me know if I'm missing something. It seems to be the same 10 Commandments in the same order, with just some different wordings on some of the longer ones. And then we get into the sections here for the laws concerning slaves. Now this is another part of the Bible which has not aged well, according to modern lights, the laws concerning slaves. Although, I mean, yeah, it depends what lens you want to look at this through. If you're brought up in a religious background like I was, uh, then you've got to say, well, look, what is God doing condoning slavery? So I think this ought to instill some sort of doubt about how the Bible is divinely inspired. But on the other hand, if you're Christopher Hitchens or somebody who's going out around telling how terrible the Bible is all the time, Christine Hayes in her lectures on the Old Testament does point out that yes, there are laws concerning slaves, but slavery was all over the ancient world, and these laws do tend to enshrine protections for the slaves. And she makes the point that the slavery as it was practiced in America in the modern era, and I'm counting anything after the French Revolution as in the modern era, as historians do. So slavery in America in the modern era was much more brutal and much worse than it was here in the Bible. You gained your freedom after 6 years, or after seventh year. In the seventh year, he may leave. He shall be free, with no compensation to pay. So she makes that point in her lectures. On the other hand, well, yeah, I guess there's a couple points to be made. I mean, one is it's ironic because we started off the book of Exodus, and I think I was talking about in the video last week about how it's no wonder that this story was so popular among African American slaves, because it talks about the Israelites suffering under the slave drivers and the overseers and the whips. But then, before we even get halfway through Exodus, then it's giving instruction on how the Israelites are going to keep slaves. So, a bit of a mixed message there. The other thing is, halfway through the section, it talks about women being slaves, and seems to be very obvious that it's talking about women as sexual slaves. So if a man sells his daughter as a slave, she shall not regain her liberty like male slaves. If she does not please her master, who intended her for himself, he must let her be brought back. Okay, so what is that talking about? Please her master. If he, meaning the master, intends her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the ruling for daughters. Okay, first of all, I don't even know what that means, according to the ruling for daughters. This is another part where you're like, oh, did I miss a section? Is something being left out? This is all throughout the Pentateuch. But if he takes another wife, he must not reduce the food of the first, or her clothing, or her conjugal rights. So I was talking about protecting her, but it's also very obvious that the slaves are being meant, the female slaves is another word for concubine, right? Which I don't know. This again, I'm breaking my own rule, in which I said I wasn't going to go all Christopher Hitchens on this, and I wasn't going to look for everything to criticize. But I can't help it, because the last time I read the Bible, I didn't notice this stuff, or it wasn't brought to my attention. I should compare this with the NIV translation, which was the one I grew up with. On the other hand, though, I guess you could say, well, how bad is this really? Because slavery was all throughout the ancient world. What's the difference between a woman being sold as a slave into marriage and a woman being married just in the traditional way, assuming women in this patriarchal society didn't have any choice about who they were marrying anyways. What's the difference? I don't know. I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna stop rambling here. There is more to talk about, as always. So much more to talk about. That's the problem with trying to review the Bible. You could spend an hour just talking about one verse. But I'm gonna call it good for this week.